At exactly 11 minutes past midnight on October 13th, 1796, the screams from beneath Randolph Manor fell silent. For more than 3 hours, wedding guests had been drinking, laughing, and spinning across polished floors. While just below their feet, Margaret Randolph clawed at cold brick walls, her silk gown shredded and smeared with blood as she fought to escape the tomb her own family had built for her. The revelers above never realized they were dancing on the grave of the bride herself, celebrating a marriage designed from the very beginning to end in her death. Her husband-to-be, along with her father, her uncle, and 3 of Annapolis's wealthiest families, had conspired to erase her and divide her fortune, crafting one of the most ruthless inheritance plots in Maryland's colonial history. Each stood to pocket thousands from her disappearance, while Margaret would vanish forever beneath the limestone foundation of the home she had grown up in. Before we uncover what really happened that autumn night, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss one of our deep dives into forgotten crimes, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from every corner of America. Margaret Randolph wasn't just another heiress. At 19, she controlled more than 12,000 pounds from her grandfather's shipping empire, with additional estates in Baltimore and Philadelphia waiting for her upon marriage. That fortune made her one of the most powerful young women in the Chesapeake, and that power made her dangerous. She wasn't content to be silent. Margaret was smart, independent, and curious about the shady dealings that had built her family's wealth. The Randolph name had been forged over 3 generations of maritime trade, land grabs, and political connections. Her grandfather, Captain James Randolph, carved out a fortune exporting tobacco and importing sugar, while her father Cornelius expanded into banking and speculation, making the Randolph estate a symbol of colonial success. Their mansion, perched high over the Severn River, was a grand Georgian house of 30 rooms, including a basement, with unusually thick limestone walls that her father ensured were soundproof. Built in 1776 by a fashionable Philadelphia architect, the basement doubled as wine cellar and storage for imported goods. But Cornelius had always envisioned a darker purpose for its design. Margaret knew every inch of that house, every creaked draft and hidden passage, and that knowledge would become her only weapon. The man chosen for her marriage, Thomas Carrington, had appeared in Annapolis the summer before, presenting himself as a wealthy Virginia tobacco merchant. Handsome, charming, and with polished manners, he slipped seamlessly into the city's elite circle. Mothers dreamed of marrying their daughters to him, and fathers welcomed his company. But Carrington was no gentleman. His real name was Thomas Garrett, a former indentured servant from Philadelphia who had reinvented himself with stolen papers and a fabricated pedigree. He had studied the ways of the Virginia aristocracy until he could pass as one of their own. Through whispered gossip in tavernas and careful observation, he learned of Margaret's fortune and the Randolph Empire. By the time he approached Cornelius Randolph, he knew enough about shipping and trade to speak like an insider, and his deception was complete. Most importantly, Thomas had chosen Margaret because she was the perfect victim. Young, wealthy, and isolated by the very father who claimed to protect her. Cornelius Randolph, despite the outward appearance of prosperity, was drowning in debt. His ships had been seized or sunk by British privateers. His investments in West Indies sugar had collapsed, and loans he'd extended to Revolutionary War veterans had gone unpaid. The family fortune existed only on paper, secured by mortgaged estates and vanished vessels. Desperate to keep creditors at bay, Cornelius had borrowed heavily against Margaret's future inheritance, gambling with wealth that was not yet his. By 1795, he owed more than 30,000 pounds, an impossible sum that threatened not only bankruptcy but imprisonment in a debtor's cell, a punishment already suffered by several of his peers. It was then that Thomas approached him, presenting not just himself as a suitor, but as the solution to a shared desperation. Thomas needed real money to maintain his false identity and escape the shadow of his past. Cornelius needed Margaret's fortune to cover his fraudulent debts. Together they crafted a scheme as ruthless as it was simple. Margaret would marry Thomas, and soon after, she would suffer a tragic accident. As her widower, Thomas would inherit her vast fortune, then divide the proceeds with Cornelius. But a crime of that scale required more hands. Cornelius recruited his brother Edmund, a respected Annapolis lawyer whose gambling debts threatened to ruin him. Edmund's legal expertise could ensure the inheritance transfer would appear seamless. He joined eagerly, seeing the plot as his lifeline. Next came Dr. Samuel Henley, the family physician who was secretly peddling opiates on the black market. Cornelius had discovered his secret and used it to force Henley's cooperation. In exchange for silence, Henley would produce a falsified death certificate attributing Margaret's passing to illness or misfortune. The final piece was William Brackenridge, a struggling local magistrate whose influence could quiet any suspicions. Offered a share of the inheritance, Brackenridge accepted, sealing the conspiracy. As autumn crept closer, Margaret began to notice. Conversations ended when she entered the room. Legal papers piled higher than she had ever seen, and her father's private meetings with Thomas stretched late into the night. Sharp and inquisitive, she began recording her observations in a secret journal. Every odd glance, every hushed whisper, every inconsistency was noted in her careful hand. What her conspirators failed to realize was that Margaret was not the naive girl they believed her to be. She was watching, listening, and preparing for something she could not yet name. Margaret's journal entries grew more frantic as the wedding day drew near. But even then, she couldn't fully grasp the scale of the danger surrounding her. October 13th arrived under a sky the color of pewter, the air biting cold as winds swept off the Chesapeake and rattled through the skeletal trees that ringed Randolph Manor. The house itself seemed to shiver, its stone walls heavy with the season's chill. Margaret rose before dawn, not out of joy, but terror, shaken awake once again by the nightmare that had haunted her for weeks. Always the same dream-dark walls, pressing in whispers, in familiar voices just beyond reach. Her own cries swallowed by silence. That morning, the vision felt sharper, heavier, as though it had crossed the line from dream into warning. When her maid Sarah laced her into the Randolph bridal gown, a white silk heirloom worn by generations before her, Margaret noticed something unsettling. The dress had been altered not for fit, but burdened with hidden lead weights stitched into its hem and sleeves. They dragged with every movement, turning elegance into restraint. When she asked about the strange additions, Sarah blanched and muttered that Mr. Randolph had ordered the changes to improve the gown's fall. But Margaret knew better. The heaviness had nothing to do with beauty. It was preparation, though, for what she dared not guess. The ceremony itself unfolded with outward perfection. 47 of Annapolis's most powerful families crowded into the drawing room. Autumn flowers masking the gloom beyond the windows. Reverend Jonathan Miles, who had known Margaret since childhood, performed the service with warmth, never realizing he presided over something closer to an execution than a wedding. He thought her quietness was nerves, unaware it was dread. Thomas's composure faltered under the weight of the moment, his palms slick, his vows stumbled, his hands shaking as he slid the ring onto her finger. Cornelius checked his watch obsessively, impatient for the service to end. Edmund lingered in the shadows, pale and somber, while Dr. Henley and Magistrate Brackenridge exchanged cryptic glances that seemed to carry unspoken meaning. At the wedding breakfast, the atmosphere felt hollow. The tables overflowed with oysters, roasted duck corn pudding, and pies. Yet Margaret's stomach turned. The weighted gown drained her strength every step more difficult than the last. The guests, too, seemed unsettled. Their smiles were too thin, their laughter too brittle. When they looked at her, it was not admiration she saw, but pity. Snatches of conversation reached her ears. Travel plans, urgent business talk of leaving Annapolis quickly, as though none intended to linger after the festivities. Margaret added each detail to the silent tallies she had been keeping for weeks. Something was terribly wrong, and everyone in the room seemed to know it but her. Margaret's unease sharpened into terror when she overheard the words that stripped away every doubt. While slipping into the study to fetch a handkerchief, she caught the muffled voices of her father Thomas and Edmund through the thin wall. What she heard froze her in place. "The basement is prepared," Cornelius said calmly, as though discussing business. "We've cleared the wine barrels, and William has brought everything we need. The limestone walls will do perfectly. Once the dancing begins, and the guests are well into their cups, we proceed." Thomas's reply wavered with nerves. "Are you certain no one will hear?" Edmund's voice came back steady, almost smug. "I oversaw the construction myself. 3 feet of limestone sound cannot escape. A cannon blast would vanish in those walls." Margaret pressed closer, her blood turning to ice. They were not planning a business deal. They were planning her imprisonment. Cornelius laid out the deception in chilling detail. Margaret would appear to grow faint and retreat from the reception. The guests would be told she had a headache, that she had retired to her chambers. By morning, the story of her elopement with a fabricated lover would explain her absence. But when they eventually discovered her weighted body in the river, it would be staged as suicide born of shame, leaving Thomas as the grieving widower. The trap was flawless. The lead stitched into her gown, the false death certificate, the magistrate's complicity, all of it designed to erase her and preserve her murderers. Margaret forced herself to keep listening, her mind cataloging every dreadful word. She learned about her father's debts, creditors threatening violence if unpaid, Edmund's ruinous gambling, Thomas's need for wealth to solidify his false Virginia identity. The plan had been weeks in the making. Wine casks shifted to create space masonry tools smuggled onto the estate, even the timing arranged, so the music and laughter would drown her final cries. When the footsteps grew closer, she darted away from the wall, her hands trembling as she pretended to shuffle through drawers. The door opened. Thomas stepped in, smiling that same smile she now recognized as a mask for a predator. "There you are, my dear. The guests are asking for you." She forced her lips into a smile, though her face felt as if it might shatter. "Of course," she replied softly, clutching the handkerchief like a prop. Back in the reception, she moved among her guests like a ghost, smiling, dancing, laughing on cue. All the while, her mind raced. She was surrounded by 47 witnesses who trusted her father implicitly. To accuse him would be unthinkable. To run would make her seem hysterical, unstable. She had no allies, no avenue of escape, and only hours before her fate was sealed beneath the limestone of her childhood home. Every twirl of the dance, every toast raised in her honor, pushed her closer to the moment when the trap would spring shut. The weights sewn into Margaret's gown no longer felt like an oddity. She now understood they were shackles disguised as finery, meant to slow her body and sap her strength. Every step dragged, every breath came harder, and her chances of escape seemed to shrink with each movement. Randolph Manor's basement, the place where the plot would come to its climax, had always unsettled her, even as a child. Carved directly into the limestone bluff, it kept a perpetual chill-damp walls, dripping with condensation that made the air heavy and close. Its narrow ground-level window admitted only the faintest daylight, and at night, the cellar dissolved into shadows that seemed alive. Margaret remembered how its peculiar acoustics had fascinated and frightened her whispers. In one corner could travel eerily to rooms above, while other spots swallowed sound altogether. She never could have imagined that the place that had frightened her as a girl was being prepared to entomb her as a bride. Cornelius had spent weeks transforming the cellar into a prison. Under the guise of reorganizing wine shipments, he cleared barrels to open a space 6 by 8 feet near the far wall, just large enough to hold a person, but small enough to be sealed with bricks. He even tinkered with the ventilation, ensuring just enough air to prolong her suffering, without allowing her a chance at survival. His cold calculations meant she would last 3 or 4 hours, time enough for guests to drink deeply, dance loudly, and cement the conspirators' alibis. The limestone walls that made the cellar ideal for wine storage would make it a perfect tomb, stifling every cry for help. William Brackenridge had arrived that morning with his carriage weighed down by supplies. He explained to curious onlookers that he was assisting Cornelius with repairs, but behind the barrels he stashed bricks, mortar, and tools. His past as a laborer gave him skill, and he had even practiced building walls, quickly ensuring he could close off the chamber in under 2 hours. But the preparations went further than masonry. Hidden among the supplies were ropes to restrain Margaret Laudanum, supplied by Dr. Henley, should she resist, and even spare clothes so the men could change if their fine attire was stained with dust mortar or blood. As the day darkened and the wine flowed freely, Margaret's eyes tracked every detail. She saw Brackenridge slipping out to his carriage again and again, carrying canvas-wrapped bundles into the house, with the calm assurance of a man working through a familiar routine. She noticed Dr. Henley arrive late, his medical bag heavy, his eyes avoiding hers. When he toasted her long and happy marriage, his shaking hands betrayed him, the words sounding like mockery only she could hear. Edmund, meanwhile, hovered near the basement door, his posture casual to anyone unaware, but in reality shepherding guests away from the one part of the house where they must not wander. All around her, the celebration spun on music, swelling voices, laughing glasses clinking. But Margaret knew it was the soundscape of her funeral. Every toast, every dance, every congratulation carried her one step closer to the moment when the conspirators would act. Edmund's genial chatter kept guests away from the stairs, but Margaret saw through the performance. Every movement, every smile was part of a script designed to herd her into the trap. By 8 o'clock, the dancing was in full swing, fiddles and flutes, filling Randolph Manor with lively tunes, while the guests, loosened by punch and wine, clapped and spun with careless joy. It was the perfect cover. No one would notice a missing bride in the swirl of music and drink. Margaret scanned the room, noting how the conspirators had spread themselves like pieces on a chessboard. Cornelius presided in the drawing room, greeting friends, raising glasses, and playing the attentive host. Edmund lingered casually near the cellar door, his posture protective, but his eyes sharp. Dr. Henley kept groups of guests entertained with booming conversation, drawing attention away from the rear of the house. And Thomas, never far from her side, waited for the moment to act. Their coordination was almost elegant, the culmination of months of planning. Margaret forced herself to study the basement entrance as if it were a battlefield. The heavy wooden door, the limestone steps plunging downward, the places in the cellar where stones jutted loose or walls swallowed sound. She committed every detail to memory. Childhood games had taught her the quirks of that underground space, the way a whisper could sometimes travel unexpectedly through the house's bones. If she was dragged below, that memory might be the only weapon she had left. Then Thomas leaned close, his voice a predator's purr disguised as concern. "My dear wife, you look flushed. Perhaps somewhere cooler would do you good." His hand gripped her arm, gentle enough for others to see affection, firm enough for her to feel control. Margaret smiled faintly, keeping her terror hidden. "I feel perfectly fine, thank you." Around them, Mrs. Henderson clucked sympathetically, telling those nearby that the poor bride did look pale. Thomas seized on it. Exactly. A moment's rest, nothing more. Margaret made one last attempt. "Perhaps some fresh air in the garden," she suggested, angling toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace and the dark lawn beyond. Freedom might have been a few steps away. But Thomas's grip tightened. "The garden is too cold. The cellar is better, it's always cool and quiet there." His tone carried the finality of a man who had no intention of changing course. As Thomas guided her toward the basement, Edmund appeared at her other side, a show of gallant support, masking his role as a guard. Across the room, Dr. Henley's voice rose in laughter, pulling attention further from the far corridor. Cornelia stood framed in the glow of the chandeliers, speaking earnestly with a cluster of merchants, the image of a host too occupied to notice his daughter slip away. The trap was closing. Every conspirator was in place. They must have rehearsed it a dozen times. Margaret thought each step timed, each gesture practiced, every possible witness accounted for, and the only unknown left was how she would react. As they went down the limestone steps, the air grew colder, and the music above faded into a muffled, otherworldly hum. Oil lamps throwing their shadows like moving threats across sweating walls. The cleared space by the far wall was unmistakable now. Its bricks and mortar half hidden behind empty casks. And when William stepped out from behind a barrel with his tools, the truth snapped into place for her like a trap closing. Cornelius stood at the base of the stairs with the same steady control he used in business. Edmund close behind Dr. Henley, lingering by the lamps like a man carrying bad news, and Thomas holding himself so politely that the danger in his smile felt obscene. Her father spoke words that sounded like regret, but landed like condemnation, and in that moment the whole betrayal became final. This was not a quarrel or desperate bluff, but a plan to make her disappear. She begged, offered to sign away every pound, promised to leave if they preferred, but Cornelius only shook his head and said it was too late, that too many debts and men depended on the outcome. Thomas produced a length of rope as calmly as a man might produce a handkerchief. And Margaret understood that they meant to bind her before the masonry began, to make sure she could not stop what they had already decided. Panic rose, but Margaret kept her mind clear, remembering the loose stones she had found as a child, the secret hollows where she once hid a ribbon and a coin, the odd acoustic quirks that sometimes carried a voice up into the house. Those memories were the only weapons she had. And as the men lurked closer, she began to think with a cold, fierce clarity about how to turn the house itself against them. Margaret had gambled everything on the strange acoustics of Randolph Manor's basement, and for a brief moment, her strategy threw the conspirators into chaos. Her screams cut through the damp air like a blade, carrying upward into the house above accusations of murder, of betrayal, of a conspiracy woven by her own blood. The lead weights that were meant to cripple her instead became weapons, and her desperate blows left Thomas staggering, blood spilling down his once elegant shirt. The clatter of shattered wine bottles was deafening, echoing through the cellar like cannon fire, and she prayed it was enough to rattle the party above. But the men recovered quickly. Edmund's attempt to silence her ended with his own cry of pain as she bit him hard enough to draw blood, forcing him back. She shifted from one resonant spot to another, her choir-trained voice striking like a bell through the limestone. Upstairs, servants were beginning to notice. Sarah paused mid-task, her ear pressed to the floorboards, as faint cries for help bled through the wood. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson stopped stirring her pots, the shouting beneath her feet more distinct with every passing second. The house was starting to listen. That was when Cornelius acted. A single brutal blow from a wine bottle sent Margaret sprawling, her vision flashing white as blood dripped into her bridal veil. She stayed conscious, clinging to the one advantage left her voice. "Hurry!" Cornelius barked, his mask of control slipping. "Someone's hurt." Brackenridge bent to his task with frantic speed, his trowel scraping and slapping mortar in hurried strokes. Each brick thudded into place like a drumbeat of doom. Dragged to the corner, Margaret felt the coarse rope bite into her wrists, but the lace she slipped into the knots gave her a thread of hope. It was nothing more than a slim chance, but it was hers. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to fight panic as the wall began to climb brick by brick. The space that had once been part of her home now shrank into a tomb, the flicker of a single oil lamp twisting the shadows into bars. The conspirators' hands shook, their voices rising in tension. They were men pressed by debts, by greed, by fear, and their haste showed. The mortar was uneven, the bricks misaligned. Weaknesses existed, if only she could survive long enough to find them. Above, the guests were starting to murmur. The bride had vanished too long. Questions were forming. The conspirators exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their scheme spreading as quickly as the cracks in Brackenridge's hurried wall. Yet down in the cold heart of Randolph Manor, Margaret felt the walls closing in inch by inch, every new brick a reminder that time was running out. She felt the rope finally slip enough to tug free, working the lace until the coarse fibers loosened against the rough stone. And then with a single wrench, she tore her hands from the bindings and scrambled to her feet as the wall rose higher. Every brick a countdown. Above, Reverend Miles had pressed past Edmund with a look that would not be denied, followed by a small group of guests and servants, curious and alarmed. And when they reached the basement door, a scrap of torn linen and the faint smell of wine and mortar told them this was no accident. So they forced the heavy wood open and flooded the cellar with shocked faces and candlelight, revealing Brackenridge bent over his hurried masonry, Henley pale and shaking near the oil lamp, Thomas reeling from the blow Margaret had given him, and Cornelius standing like a man who had finally seen the cost of his calculations, while the half-finished wall and scattered tools made the lie impossible to hide. Someone shouted for the sheriff. Someone else seized Thomas and clapped rough hands on his arms. Sarah and Mrs. Patterson pointed to the broken bottles and to Margaret in her stained silk, still breathing and defiant. And as the guests crowded in, outrage cutting questions into the hush, the conspirators stammered excuses that could not mend the mortar or the betrayals. And though the night would not be the last word on inheritance or justice, Margaret Randolph had turned the very acoustics of her childhood basement into her salvation, and the house that was meant to be her tomb now held the living proof of a crime. The flickering lamplight revealed a scene no guest at Randolph Manor would ever forget. Margaret, trembling but unbroken, stood atop the half-built wall that was meant to be her tomb, her torn silk gown hanging in shreds and streaked with blood and mortar. Her hair clung damply to her face, her eyes wild but blazing with a fierce defiance that silenced the cellar. Around her, the conspirators froze like guilty statues, Cornelius gripping a broken bottle as if it were still a weapon, Thomas clutching his ruined nose, Brackenridge spattered in mortar dust with trowel in hand, and Edmund pale as chalk at the foot of the stairs. Reverend Miles, Margaret gasped, pointing down at them with a hand still trembling from the effort of escape. They tried to murder me. My father, my husband, my uncle, and their accomplices, they meant to wall me alive in this cellar to steal my inheritance. Her voice cracked, but carried echoing up the stone walls and out into the hall, where more guests were beginning to crowd the stairwell. For a long, dreadful heartbeat, no one moved. The oil lamp sputtered, illuminating the crude, half-finished wall behind Margaret, the scattered tools, the broken bottles, and the ropes that still dangled from her wrists. It was evidence enough for anyone with eyes to see. Reverend Miles's face hardened the genial warmth of the wedding minister, giving way to the steel of a man who had once fought battles for freedom. "Seize them," he commanded, his voice steady and grim. "This is no misunderstanding. This is attempted murder." Several men from the wedding neighbors, merchants, even a cousin moved forward, their shock quickly replaced by outrage. They stripped weapons from the conspirators, dragging them back against the walls. Cornelius struggled, sputtering excuses about debts and honor, but the words sounded hollow in the dank cellar air. Thomas tried to plead, insisting it was all a mistake, yet the sight of blood on his shirt and rope at his feet betrayed him. Margaret's knees buckled, and Reverend Miles himself caught her as she slid down from the crumbling wall. "You're safe now, child," he said softly. Though his eyes never left the men who had plotted her death, the truth will see the light of day. And as the guests pulled the conspirators upstairs into the glare of the chandeliers and the judgment of their community, the sound of music had stilled, replaced by whispers of horror. The wedding feast was over. In its place came the reckoning. The proof in the cellar shut down every excuse. Fresh mortar gluing the conspiracy to the floor. Broken glass and a shattered lamp scattered like testimony, the rope that had bound her lying in a slick pool of wine and dust, and Thomas flailed for a defense, insisting she was hysterical, and that they had only tried to calm her. But the sight of 4 men caked in mortar and the half-built wall made that lie impossible to swallow. Brackenridge crumpled, first sobbing that he could not in good conscience seal a living woman in a tomb, and his breakdown opened the floodgates, forcing Dr. Henley to mutter about the death certificate he had agreed to provide, before fear made him name names. Edmund babbled attempts at legal rationales that only exposed his own ruined practice and debts. And Cornelius was unmasked as an embezzler who had been living on borrowed paper wealth, while Thomas turned out to be an alias, a wanted fraudster from Philadelphia who had studied the Randolphs until he knew exactly how to take them apart, each revelation stacking like the bricks that had almost buried her. Margaret stood above them, blood and mortar streaking her gown, calm enough to point out what mattered most, that they had sewn lead into her dress to slow her, to keep her from fighting. That every detail had been planned so her death would look like shame, and the inheritance would slide into waiting hands. And as the full horror of their scheme spread through the house, the guests moved from shock to fury, and the celebration that had been meant to cover a crime began to break apart under the weight of what had been revealed. Cornelius finally raised his eyes to his daughter, the mask of cold calculation slipping into something raw, fear, regret, and a desperate attempt at justification. "The debts, Margaret. You don't understand. The threats were real. If I couldn't pay, they would have destroyed all of us. I thought this way, you would have a quick death and the family name could survive." His words rang hollow in the damp cellar air. Margaret, battered and bloodied but unbroken, answered with a steadiness that silenced every whisper in the room. "You chose to murder me rather than face the consequences of your own crimes. You chose to pay with my life for your greed and your cowardice." Her words carried the weight of judgment, not just for Cornelius, but for every man who had plotted against her. By then the basement had filled with guests drawn by Reverend Miles's urgent calls. Lanterns, bobbed voices overlapped in horrified disbelief. and the truth of the conspiracy became undeniable. The joyous clamor of the wedding feast had given way to whispers of scandal, the kind that would stain families for generations. By midnight, October 13th, 1796, the marriage that was meant to cement wealth and influence had unraveled into one of the most shocking crimes Annapolis had ever seen. The conspirators were placed under citizen's arrest, held under guard until the sheriff arrived at dawn. Guests, many of them prominent figures in the colony, preserved the scene with almost prosecutorial precision. The unfinished wall, the mortar-stained tools, the ropes, the shattered bottles, even the lead-stitched gown, all of it was secured as damning evidence. Margaret herself refused to retreat into shock or silence. She directed servants to record statements, insisted witnesses be identified, and made certain no detail of the plot would be lost to rumor or distortion. The fallout spread quickly. Letters went out by courier confirming that Thomas Carrington was in truth Thomas Garrett, a wanted swindler in Philadelphia. His carefully crafted persona disintegrated overnight, replaced by a trail of fraud and theft that spanned colonies. Dr. Henley's whispered admissions led to the collapse of his medical practice and charges not just of conspiracy, but of illegal drug sales. Brackenridge's public breakdown stripped him of his magistrate's seat and invited scrutiny into every case he had touched. Edmund's legal career, already teetering under debts and scandal, was obliterated. He faced not only imprisonment, but disgrace among his peers across the colonies. Cornelius Randolph, once the pillar of a proud shipping dynasty, found his empire revealed as a house of cards. Fraudulent ledgers borrowed fortunes in a scheme that would have collapsed even without his daughter's murder. His name, once associated with respectability, became synonymous with betrayal. By sunrise, the chandeliers of Randolph Manor cast their glow not on a bride and groom, but on a daughter who had stared down her own burial and forced the truth into the light. Margaret's gown, torn and stained with blood and limestone, lay across a table beside the lead weights removed from its hem, artifacts of both her near death and her survival. The Randolph fortune was destined to dissolve in restitution and debt, the manor itself marked forever by what had nearly happened beneath its foundation. The most haunting truth was not the crime itself, but how nearly it had succeeded. Had Margaret not remembered the basement's strange acoustics, had she not fought with every ounce of wit and defiance, her screams would have been silenced forever behind stone. Instead, her voice carried through the house and through history, exposing one of the darkest conspiracies of colonial Maryland. If Margaret Randolph hadn't overheard that single whispered conversation, if she hadn't pieced together its meaning with razor-sharp intelligence, if she hadn't remembered the strange acoustics of her childhood home well enough to send her screams rising through stone, she would have died in the basement that night, and the scheme would have succeeded flawlessly. Yet, by refusing to accept the role of victim, she not only saved her own life, but prevented others from suffering a similar fate. The Randolph plot was not merely about silencing one heiress. It was a template for how desperation and greed could conspire against the vulnerable. By surviving, Margaret exposed the very blueprint of the crime and ended it before it could inspire imitators. The limestone cellar that was meant to be her tomb was eventually filled with rubble, a silent monument to her defiance. For years, Randolph Manor stood as a haunted landmark in Annapolis society whispered about at gatherings long after its windows had gone dark. The true legacy, though, was not the ruined house or the disgraced family. It was Margaret's voice. In her testimony before colonial authorities, she admitted that the most chilling wound was not the blow to her temple or the ropes that cut her wrists, but the betrayal of her father, her uncle, and the man who had sworn vows to her only hours before. The horror was not only physical, It was intimate. What began as a wedding became a crucible of survival. Margaret had turned the conspirators' careful planning against them, fought with wit instead of brute force, and lived to tell the tale. Her ordeal became a cautionary story passed through the colonies, a reminder that money could corrupt even blood ties, and that sometimes survival depended on refusing to surrender when all escape seemed impossible. The lead weights stitched into her gown, meant to drag her body to the bottom of the Severn River, were laid out in court as evidence of cold-blooded intent. The basement walls that were supposed to swallow her screams became proof of the crime, and the exposure of such an audacious plot forced Maryland's lawmakers to act. Colonial courts began to demand stricter witnesses for inheritance transfers, tighter oversight of attorneys, and new protections for women whose wealth made them targets. For decades, judges cited the case of Margaret Randolph as a precedent, her defiance reshaping the laws that governed family and fortune in early America. Her survival mattered far beyond one autumn night in 1796. It transformed a tale of greed, betrayal, and almost perfect murder into a legacy of reform and warning. Randolph Manor was remembered not only as the site of an attempted crime, but as the place where a young woman's courage changed the course of justice. So what do you think really happened that night at Randolph Manor? Could such an elaborate conspiracy have played out under the noses of 47 wedding guests? Was this an isolated act of desperation, or proof that even in colonial America, greed was clever enough and cruel enough to turn family into executioners? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next tale of crime, horror, and history uncovered.